50%. So 1 in 5 of your neighbors who's a renter is giving half of their paycheck to their landlord every month. What this is doing in a lot of communities is pushing people into other communities and causing displacement, which is particularly affecting minority communities. This is very problematic. I think this issue was very apparent in our election last year, and it's something that ongoing we're going to have to confront and try to figure out how to solve. There's also a climate crisis, and you already know about this, so I'm not going to talk about it. There's a health crisis as well. So 40% of Americans in 2016 were obese. North Carolina, again, a little bit better, 34%, 1 in 3. In 2017, there were 40,000 people killed in traffic accidents in the United States. 40,000. 80% of Americans don't get enough exercise. We're burning, on average, 140 calories fewer than we were 50 years ago. We also have a political crisis, if you didn't know. So this is an interesting stat. I've never heard about like the median or typical Republican or typical Democrat, but the median or typical Democrat or Republican is now more conservative than 94% of Democrats, and the median Democrat is more liberal than 92% of Republicans. Translated, 43% of Republicans have a very unfavorable view of Democrats, and 38% of Democrats have a very unfavorable view of Republicans. And you're probably thinking, I thought this was an ADU event, and it is. And they're not a panacea, but I think, it's my opinion that we are facing these crises. These are crises, and we need to figure out how to solve them. And an interesting thing about ADUs is that they're a very small solution, but they're a solution that addresses every single one of those. And I think it's worth acknowledging that when we talk about how ADUs are going to work in Raleigh when they do work. And I think they are going to work eventually. We just have to figure out how to get there. So my whole thing is ADUs are ultimately about democratizing development, letting communities have control over how we grow. So how do we avoid displacement? How do we grow? Make sure the rent's not rising too much, that it's not too damn high, and how aggressively we confront the crises that we are facing. So with that said, what are ADUs? You may know them if you come from somewhere else as by another name. I lived in Toronto for 3 years, and up there they were laneway houses because there's laneways or alleyways all over the city. And they struggled with this issue of laneway housing for years and years and years, and they're finally getting to it, and it's really transforming the city. You may know them as granny flats, mother-in-law suites. I'd never heard of Sidekick, but I think that's kind of cool. Tiny house, ancillary unit. So what are they? They really are a basement apartment or a garage apartment. They're also a separated unit. But what we're really talking about here is a physically separated accessory dwelling unit that is not part of the property's main house. They're almost always required to be behind the main house, and they have everything that a typical apartment would have. So usually 1 bedroom, living room / kitchen, bathroom. It's interesting, in Raleigh today, you can actually build an accessory structure in your backyard with a bathroom, with even a kitchen sink, but with not a heating element or maybe more extensive plumbing. But you can't have a stove or an oven or a real kitchen. which I think is interesting. In Raleigh today, it's also important to note that if you have an attached garage on your house, you can convert that to an apartment. It's attached. If you have a house and you want to sort of subdivide it and create an apartment, you can do that. So what we're really talking about is separated accessory dwelling units and whether or not they should be allowed in Raleigh like they are in almost every single city in the country. So what do they look like? So they can be super contemporary and expensive and even bigger than the primary house, although they wouldn't be allowed to be so here in Raleigh the way the ordinance was written. They can be much smaller and maybe more contextual to something like the fabric that we have here in Raleigh. They can be kind of rustic and really small and made on the cheap, on the very cheap. They can be sort of quaint, built above a garage. They can be super mod, really integrated into the main house. You can see this nice little patio that they share with the main house. Or they can be completely small and completely separated from the primary dwelling. So you're looking at these pictures and you're like, well, how are these things going to address all those massive crises that he was just talking about? And well, we have data from other cities because other cities have been doing this long enough. ADUs are still a very sort of nascent solution that people around the city have been trying, but the facts are that in Portland, for example, 15% of ADU residents pay $0 in rent. So those are mostly going to be elderly parents of adults who maybe have moved out of their main house and want to be close to the grandkids, want to help raise the grandkids. So they're moving in. In the Bay Area, we know that ADUs across the board rent for about 19% less than market rate, and I'm sure we all know the Bay Area is sort of the poster child for exorbitant rises in rents, and we're not there, and we probably will never get there. In fact, we won't ever get to where San Francisco is, but the rents are rising, and they're rising fast for a lot of people. Anecdotally, we know, I was just talking to a coworker today who said that 3 years ago, she actually lived in an ADU in Oakwood and rented it out for $600 a month. And I think the typical apartment in Oakwood, maybe a newer place, could probably fetch at least double that. The other thing about ADUs and costs are the cost to build them. So the typical affordable housing unit around the country, I think the average cost is something like $300,000 per unit. The City Council just here approved funding to refurbish and construct affordable housing at the Sir Walter Apartments in downtown and the Beacon Ridge. And the figures are here. So $241,000 at Sir Walter, and I'm not, I think that's a great thing. I think that, we need a diverse downtown with different types of people. So this is not a statement on council's decision to approve that funding, but when you look at the potential that we could be building ADUs at a cost of $70,000 to $150,000 per unit, it's kind of striking. AARP has had an official policy since 2000 supporting ADUs as an affordable housing option for seniors. But all that said, they are voluntarily affordable. There's no reason somebody couldn't build an ADU today and rent it out for double market rate and pay their mortgage and their kids' way to school with it. It's completely voluntary, so we have to be careful by calling ADUs affordable housing. It's not completely affordable housing, and I think we do ourselves a disservice when we do call it affordable housing outright. We have to be more nuanced about it, but the fact of the matter is that no matter what the rent is, it is increasing supply, and theoretically, with an increase in supply, the rents should maintain themselves somewhat more than they are. So about the climate crisis. So in Portland, this is, so you're going to see a lot about Portland tonight because Portland has been building ADUs at a clip probably faster than any other city in North America, aside from maybe Vancouver. Pacific Northwest is, I think, ahead of the game here. But for every ADU in Portland, there's not even one car. What that means is that people who are living in ADUs are typically not driving cars, they're biking, they're walking, they're taking transit. San Francisco and Seattle, among other cities, don't require parking if in areas near transit. And when the proposal was being written for Raleigh, it was sort of specifically done in a way that would not require parking as a means to support the massive transit investment that Wake County had just made or was just about to make. And I think that's an incredible part of this proposal. And I think that, if we can get this thing passed without a parking requirement, people around the country are going to look at Raleigh and say, yeah, they're really serious about where they're going and about growth and becoming a bigger city. The other thing about the climate crisis and ADUs is discussion about building materials. And so most affordable units today around the country, less so in Raleigh, are being made in apartment buildings with a lot of concrete and a lot of steel. Here we're still doing a lot of wood frame. A lot of downtown development is done wood frame over maybe a concrete and steel podium. But the fact is that concrete and steel account for a massive amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Concrete production alone is 5% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the world. ADUs are almost made exclusively with wood, maybe a little bit of concrete for the foundation and a little bit of steel here and there, but very small amounts generally. Energy use, so a 2,300 square foot home, this is big. Half of that size would be a massive ADU, but you can sort of extrapolate that a smaller ADU would consume less energy. And this is a little bit murkier because obviously an ADU is just sort of 1 or 2 people at most, so they're using less energy, it's a smaller space, but nevertheless, I think a lot of people in this country are interested in downsizing their living spaces. Health crisis. So these are sort of indirect stats. So most ADUs are going to be located in more walkable communities. So Mordecai, who stuck their neck out and asked City Council for ADUs 3 years ago now, is a walkable community. It's relatively close to downtown. You can bike to downtown or almost any inside the Beltline neighborhood relatively easily from there. And most ADUs around the country are in neighborhoods. Most people who are interested in building ADUs live in walkable neighborhoods or want their neighborhoods to be more walkable. But unwalkable suburbia correlates with just a number of really bad health indices. So again, auto dependence leads to greater health problems. Mental health, so this is something that's being studied more and more, but neighborhoods with active transportation options are shown to have a positive impact on mental health. This is, I think, just something we need to continue to consider as we grow and think about where we're putting the people who are moving to our population, and do we want to build a city made of people who have, who are experiencing mental issues because of their built environment. The political crisis. So this is something I think everybody across the political spectrum can get behind. Right wing, left wing. We can build affordable housing at no cost to taxpayers with ADUs. There's an interesting guy, his name is Jonathan Coppage, I believe is his name, and he was actually in Raleigh a couple weeks ago, and he's a conservative thinker and a conservative writer who works for a conservative organization in Washington, D.C., and he actually happens to be from my hometown, Winston-Salem, and I think grew up very close to where I grew up. It was just kind of weird. I need to reach out to him. But he talks a lot about conservative urbanism, and it's, you know, traditional town planning and traditional urban form and this sort of thing. And ADUs, to him, fit perfectly within that. And so I think that this is something that everybody can get behind and reach a compromise on. And wouldn't it be a good example for other issues that we're trying to work through in this country? So I was convinced by all that. I don't know about you, but who wouldn't support ADUs after hearing that sort of argument? So ADUs are being considered at City Council as we speak. I'll get into the timeline of sort of how it got there and where we are in just a moment, but they are considering it. It's been to the Growth and Natural Resources Committee. I was there a couple weeks. It's going to be there Wednesday, I think. So if you're interested in all of this, just please stay tuned, go to the meeting, attend, watch online at RTN. So why are we talking about ADUs now? So I'll go real quickly through this because I think I'm going slowly. But so Thomas Jefferson apparently lived in an ADU while he was building Monticello. Raleigh is founded in 1792, and until the 1950s, every single neighborhood in Raleigh had ADUs. If you look at those sort of cool bird's eye drawings of Raleigh from like 1900, almost every single property had at least one accessory structure. They were carriage houses. They were, you know, places where other people lived, and they were everywhere. And this was the condition in every American city, every Canadian city for that matter too. So in the 1950s is really when cities started cracking down on ADUs, and I think, you know, it's not a coincidence that this happened at a time when racial discrimination was rampant, redlining was rampant, white flight was rampant. These policies were enacted by people who were very interested in building highways and not housing and communities. So in 2013, Raleigh was considering adopting a new unified development ordinance, which is the type of form-based zoning code. And there was a proposal to allow ADUs as of right or in any residential district, in most of the mixed-use districts, without any extra requirements. And over a few drafts, the proposal was changed, and then ultimately it was scrapped from the proposal, and it was not adopted. So 2 years later, Mordecai, the neighborhood, got together and said, you know, we'd like to explore the option of having ADUs in our neighborhood. Can we do a pilot study? And so pilot studies are potentially not legal, but they're not something that Raleigh's planning department does. And so when I was there, what we did was we said, well, we'll explore the options to allowing them. So we drafted a proposal, and it went to City Council last year in July, and it was sent to the Growth and Natural Resources Committee on July 5th, and it was heard for the first time 10 months later in late May, and it's going to be heard again on Wednesday again. So, and then you're here. So a lot's happened in the last 3 years. A little bit more background on how that process went. There's 854, I think, property owners in Mordecai. We sent every single person a notice in the mail saying we're doing an online survey. If you want a paper survey, let us know and we'll give you one. We got a 20% response rate, which is actually very high for like a planning department to do a survey. 75% of people said they want ADUs. 12% said no, and then the rest said, I don't really know. So that sort of gave us the go-ahead to keep moving and studying, and we studied the hell out of Mordecai. We looked at dozens and dozens of properties and said, well, how would the regulations work on this property, and where could an ADU fit here, or where could it fit here? And so this really allowed the city a way to sort of substantiate a lot of the recommendations that were being proposed in the ordinance, which is here. And so I should also say that the Planning Commission's Text Change Committee did a really amazing job at sort of managing a process of public input. We had Mordecai residents, some of whom are here tonight, who came to those meetings and provided a lot of really valuable input and really had an impact on the way the ordinance ultimately looked. All of this is online. I'm not going to go into the details of the ordinance for now, but I think we were able to, with the Planning Commission, work it into something that everybody could really get behind, except for one key thing, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. So we also looked at what other cities in North Carolina are doing, and again, Raleigh's the only city that does not allow accessory dwelling units. Durham has been very successful and put the foot forward on that. Charlotte allows them. Asheville allows them. They're having issues with short-term rentals and ADUs in general and short-term rentals in general, but they allow them nevertheless. Winston-Salem, Greensboro, Wilmington, you name it, they all allow them. So the problem, in my eyes, is the overlay proposal, and I'm happy to talk about this or answer questions, or we can have a conversation about this. But in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of experts around the country who we've talked to, the overlay proposal is somewhat of a poison pill, that it's going to be very difficult to get an overlay passed because you have to get 50% of your neighbor's signatures plus one to sign a rezoning petition for their property, and then it has to go through a 6-month rezoning process. It's very expensive for staff time. Nevertheless, that is the proposal. If that's what it has to be, maybe that's a tiny, tiny baby step that we can take. But I think everybody's skeptical that we would have one ADU after the overlay was approved. So again, costs a lot of money and staff time, potentially opens the door to discrimination, and like I said, probably won't work. ADU opponents in every city when ADUs are first proposed, and even today, worry about impacts on neighborhood character, about parking, about the influx of renters into neighborhoods that are almost exclusively owner-occupied. So what are those experts who are telling us that the overlay isn't going to work? What are they saying about ADUs? So they're saying don't just allow them, mandate them. So the province of Ontario, where I used to live, passed a couple years ago a mandate that every city in the province had to authorize secondary units, and that they believe that they're a critical piece of the pie in solving the housing crisis that is huge in Toronto, where I used to live. California is the same. January 1st, they just passed 3 laws addressing ADUs and how they can promote them. And they have this, this statement that ADUs are an essential component in addressing the housing needs in California. Don't just mandate them, promote them. So what Portland did, so Portland has had this sort of really small ADU scene for quite some time, dating back like 20 years. And they were getting at most 20 built in 1 year. And we all know Portland has become a very sort of popular place. Their economy is booming. Everybody wants to move to Portland. Their housing crisis was getting out of hand. So what they did in 2009 was they waived these massive fees. So there's like a $12,000 fee that you have to pay in Portland to build a house. And that applied to ADUs as well. So what they said is we need affordable units. We need to densify and support transit. So they waived that fee for ADUs. And in that first year, they saw a rise. And they've seen a rise in every year since, such that in 2015, sorry, I don't have the most recent data, they almost had 500 ADU permits per year. So you think about this, let's be generous and say 80% of those are affordable. That's like 300 something affordable housing units in 1 year built by middle class people for the most part. not developers from Seattle or LA or San Francisco. These were people in the neighborhood. And what else has that done in Portland? So they've been doing it long enough that they've developed this like ecosystem of accessory dwelling unit startups and really cool community initiatives. So there's this company called Dweller, who they will create a lease, and a homeowner signs a lease with them, and then Dweller will lift a prefab ADU with a crane into their backyard, and the owner gets 30% of the rent. Dweller keeps 70% of it. If the homeowner wants to own it outright, they can just buy that from Dweller right away. At any moment, they can buy it from Dweller. But the point is that this is a sort of innovative company. Who knows if they'll be around in 5 years, but this is an innovation in the affordable housing crisis that is simply not allowed to happen in Raleigh because we can't even allow ADUs in the first place. Parking problems. So parking problems are a concern. I think they will be a concern. If you live in a neighborhood where parking is already difficult, which is no neighborhood in Raleigh. I used to live in New York. I used to live in Toronto. There's not a parking problem in Raleigh. It may be more difficult for you to find a parking space in your neighborhood, and we may need to work on that. You know, like, let's allow ADUs and see how it works, and if parking is a pain in your neighborhood, then maybe the ordinance can be revised a little bit to require parking in certain neighborhoods. But for the most part, parking concerns have not played out when cities have introduced ADUs. ADUs, so I think this is actually one of the coolest and strongest arguments for ADUs. They support the local economy. I work for a design firm that does not build ADU. We wouldn't design ADUs, we do bigger stuff, but almost always ADUs are designed and built by local firms with local labor. I would wager to say that almost every single apartment building in downtown Raleigh was heavily financed by somebody from Atlanta or New York or LA or somewhere else. So these are units that are being developed with Raleigh money, and that money is staying in Raleigh. You're increasing the tax value of the property, and you're providing additional revenue for the tax base as well. So again, this is all about democratizing development, sharing the impacts of growth rather than displacing vulnerable communities, sharing the spoils of growth rather than a system where only the very wealthy can develop, and letting communities ultimately decide how aggressively they want to fight the crises facing us rather than deferring to lagging and hamstrung bureaucracies and markets. So that's it. I'd be happy to, I think this was supposed to be a discussion, so I'm gonna come down and we can talk, or if you want me to answer questions from up here, that's cool too. Whatever you want to do. So the Growth and Natural Resources Committee first heard the proposal at the end of May. And so they had, I think about 35 people from the public came and spoke. 25, I think, were in favor of the proposal, and 10 spoke against the proposal. What I'm hearing is 25 to 10. I wasn't there, so I can't say for sure. But so I understand that the Growth and Natural Resources Committee, which is GNR, which is the coolest name for the most uncool committee. No, I'm joking. I like the name GNR, and I like GNR. But so they're actually looking through the comments right now. They're probably already finished, and they're gonna come back on Wednesday and report somehow on the comments that they heard. It's not likely that they'll take additional public comments, but you never know. If enough people show up and want to talk or want to be heard or want to ask questions, then maybe they will open it up. So that's where they are. And then after Growth and Natural Resources, they will make a recommendation on Wednesday, and then it will go to the full council, and the full council can do whatever they want with the recommendation of growth and natural resources, but likely would go along with whatever that recommendation was. Yep. Let's just take this one back here first.
So this has been great. These are amazing statistics. I'm curious if there are any kind of similar stories in. Do you want me to repeat the whole thing? No. Okay. So I'm curious if there are any similar stories about ADUs in southern cities or cities that are really getting to Durham.
So
that's the second part. And how is Durham proceeding with its policy? I know that's being debated right now as well.
Okay, so the first part was, are there other southern cities, particularly that are dealing with ADUs? And so Nashville is one. I would say if Raleigh has the worst ADU policy in the country, Nashville has the closest to that. Nashville allows ADUs only in historic districts, which you can imagine are very wealthy. Nashville just rejected like a $5 billion transit referendum. They're having a lot of problems with growth and density right now. We're doing a much better job generally than them, I would say.
Yeah.
But
I would agree. I live there. I would agree.
Right. So some communities have tried a similar approach, like a sort of similar to our NCOD, where they would allow ADUs, but that hasn't been successful. So they're in a stalemate. As for Durham, well, actually, Austin is another city if you consider Texas the South. So Austin's interesting because it's a huge college town, and I think, from my understanding, when they initially rolled ADUs out, they targeted them to neighborhoods near the university as a means to provide affordable housing for students, which is like the complete opposite of the way the discussion here went, where a lot of the opposition came from the neighborhoods along Hillsborough Street saying, we don't want more students in our backyard. So I think that's a very sort of interesting, counterpoint. But yeah, no, every other city in the South allows them, and they've not had any problems. Durham, so Durham has allowed them. They don't require parking downtown with ADUs in a certain area. Other areas they do. I think they're allowed in most residential neighborhoods. Durham has seen most of their ADU development happen in the neighborhoods around Duke as student housing. And with a tuition that's $60,000 a year, you better have affordable housing for the students. So I think that there were a lot of concerns that Duke students were going to come live in the backyard of your house and party all night and just raise a ruckus, and that's just not happened. I've spoken, this is an anecdote, but a developer who's built a lot of affordable accessory dwelling units in Durham has said that the city of Durham, I think, has received 0 complaints from ADU residents. And he has an interesting sort of take on it. And he says that the type of person who wants to live in an ADU is not the type of person who's like staying up all night partying and like playing loud music. They like being in a quiet community. They like, being tucked away into somebody's backyard. If I'm like coming down to Glenwood and partying all night, I probably don't want to like scramble back into my backyard apartment. I'd probably just rather like go into some big apartment building. So that's his take. Yep.
There have been some in Cameron Park and Oakwood and different places. There's some historical ADUs. Have the city gotten complaints on those?
No. And that's a good point that I didn't mention, is that in Raleigh, if you can demonstrate that your accessory dwelling unit has been lived in and not laid vacant for 1 year or longer, then your unit is grandfathered in, and so it's legal. And there are ADUs all over Cameron Park, all over Oakwood, all over Mordecai, and all over Boylan Heights, and they're lived in. And it's the same thing. I mean, if the people who are, the homeowner can kick the tenant out if they're like partying every night or disturbing the peace in some way. But it's also the people who are living in these are just not doing that. I think the facts have just been shown to be that way.
Anyone else? So you spoke about the Durham ADU being able to develop by right there. Durham right now is also working on decreasing regulatory barriers to ADU development because despite being able to develop them by right, they have not received very many applications to develop them. So I'm curious to what extent you were able to review things like setbacks and size of ADUs and how maybe Portland was able to increase the ability for them to do like 500 ADUs a year. I can't read that, but I'm curious if you could speak to
Yeah, I
that.
will. So that's a very good question. So we did, we worked with Sarah and the rest of the Mordecai community over almost a year to get the regulation, to tweak the regulations. And so with setbacks, the city council, the last version of the council proposal in 2013 was going to have 35-foot setbacks. And I don't know about you, but I don't have a property that's wide enough to fit an ADU with 35-foot setbacks. Nobody, unless you live on a 5-acre property, I don't think you could. So we did a lot of analysis. We looked at what other cities are doing. The side setbacks that are proposed in Raleigh are actually more restrictive than every city except for Charlotte. Durham, the setbacks are 3 feet and 5 feet. As proposed here, they'd be 10 and 15 feet. 15 feet if it's a 2-story ADU. So if you build a new 2-story or put an ADU on top of your garage, you have to be set back 15 feet. At least the second floor would have to be set back 15 feet. We would be the only city with aside from Winston-Salem, which I think has actually revised their regulations, that has a building separation requirement, which is the separation between the main house and the ADU. So that would be 10 feet. About Portland, I don't know too much about Portland's setbacks, but these are basically the way they are around the country. I mean, there's not much variation in terms of setbacks, so the size. So that was another, so in Raleigh, let me see if I can get back there. You cannot be more than 800 square feet, that's the max, or no larger than 50% of the heated area of the primary residence, whichever is smaller. I'm not going to get back to it. But so yeah, that was also tweaked. That was not the original proposal that we came up with. That was something that was reached through consensus with the text change committee at the Planning Commission and mostly Mordecai residents and some other concerned citizens. So that was a very nice process, and you would hope that City Council would respect that. Yep.
I was just going to say, talking about regulatory barriers, Durham's considering reducing theirs, and we're talking about a 6-month overlay process. We're talking about, as opposed to by right development. I mean, in Raleigh, we're definitely not thinking about reducing the barriers to building an ADU, right? We're in high contrast to what Durham's talking about.
Yeah, we are talking about reducing the barriers to ADUs in Raleigh because we don't allow them today, right?
Okay, so, but in comparison to Durham's policy.
Yeah, right. The overlay proposed, so I should say, no other city in the country or in Canada has an overlay attached to ADUs. It's never been tried for good reason. It's very problematic, and it's not something that anybody's ever tried. So we had a question here, and then we'll go back there.
What was the name of the guy that you mentioned was here last week?
Jonathan Coppage. I could be getting his last name right, but I think it's Coppage.
Okay.
Jonathan is his first name.
And then in my neighborhood, the complaint I hear isn't maybe so much of a parking problem, but it's a driving problem.
Yeah.
It's like if you go down, and I know it's not because of ADUs, but like you go down Bickett Boulevard, and I mean, you can't even get from one end of the street to the other because it's so full, and I think that's the perception. I mean, that's more because it's become McMansion Row, but ADU, if you add ADUs on top of that. So I know we'd like to think that people are going to be riding their bikes and walking and doing all that, but there's also an effective reality of vehicles, and how do we really address that?
Yeah, I mean, right, and that is something that would have to be a sort of trial and error. And if some neighborhoods are experiencing particular problems with parking or something else related to ADUs, maybe we can just be flexible and revise the regulations. But we'll never know unless we allow them in the first place. In a neighborhood like yours, if they're building mansions, are there mostly like larger lots in that neighborhood? So they're like building almost to the limits.
Yeah.
So you would hope that somebody, if it was in that kind of case, that they would go ahead and provide a parking space for their ADU resident. It might help with the marketability of the unit, like it'd be easier to rent your ADU to somebody who really needs to drive if they have a place to park their car. But yeah, I mean, that's a good point. But again, we'll never know unless we build them in the first place. Yep.
So we're into having an overlay. I mean, that's what I'm hearing from people that are going to get to vote on this. What is the rationale?
So the rationale is to let neighborhoods decide if they want ADUs in their own neighborhood. And so the overlay, the way it would work is that, let's say I want my neighborhood to have ADUs. I would have to first identify a contiguous 15-acre area. Second, I would have to go to the city and say, does this 15-acre contiguous area satisfy the requirements? They would say yes. And so then I would go back to my neighborhood and knock on everybody's door and try and get 50% of the signatures plus one to sign what is essentially a rezoning petition for that 15-acre area. So let's say I get that. I get 50% plus one, and the other 49.5% of the people are really angry about it. That's going to be a problem. So I'm going to go to city council. I'm going to go to the planning department. I'm going to submit my rezoning. It's going to go, they're going to do a staff report. It's going to go to the planning commission. Planning commission is going to look at it. It's going to say this is consistent with the comprehensive plan. It's going to go to city council. Theoretically, they would approve it. That whole process takes, at a minimum, 3 months, but it typically takes more like at least 6 months and could take even longer. It could take years. And then the overlay allows you to build one, so then you have to draw up the plans, find a contractor, build it. So by the time you've started the whole process, it's going to be probably 2, more likely 3 years before you get it built.
Okay, so I guess what I think I'm hearing you say is that they're looking at the overlay because they really don't want ADUs.
Your words, not mine.
So,
Current residents of the neighborhood making those decisions about future residents, correct?
Yes, good point. Current property owners making decisions about future residents who are not property owners, probably almost exclusively.
so I want to make sure that I ask this question because I know that people on GNR who are voting for this are going to raise this point if any of them watch the video, is they have apparently downplayed the overlay piece where instead of needing like the equivalent of an NCOD, they are talking about something comparable to like a sidewalk petition where apparently it would be a lot more individualized and a much smaller area would get to have a say over if they have an ADU. So I'm still not for the overlay requirement, but what would you see if they reduce that to like 100-yard area from your property? What would still be the
So
negative
I'm not
impact?
a legal expert, but I think that's illegal.
Okay.
You can't rezone a property without a signature of a property owner in that area. So if it's not a rezoning, I'm not sure what it was, and if that's their proposal, I think they should articulate it before proposing that.
I think they're gonna do that at the meeting. I think I think it's been happening in discussions, off and on, and my understanding is that part of the agenda of the next meeting is to bring up what options for a lighter overlay will be in order to try to get the 5 votes that are needed to allow something.
So my only response to that is it'd be great if we could have public input on that.
Amen.
I'm curious how the setback requirements and sort of zoning requirements for an ADU compare to an existing garage. So if you have an existing garage that has a studio up top, the conversion to an ADU, if you meet current practice, how does that look?
Yeah, so trains. So if you have an existing garage, I don't know off the top of my head. I've sort of scrubbed that from my memory, what the setback for a garage is. But let's say you have a garage that is today closer, it's 5 feet? Okay, so if it's 5 feet, you could not have an ADU in that garage because it's closer unless you went and got a variance, which is possible and you can do. But let's say it's 10 feet. Let's say your garage is 10 feet from the property line and you want to build above it, you would have to step back the second floor 5 feet, which is doable. I mean, you can do it. We tested it out. As long as your garage, the footprint of your garage is big enough to accommodate an ADU with that setback taken into account, you could do it.
So you discussed how the initial prohibition of ADUs was kind of motivated, at least partially, by concerns about student housing, and kind of seems like a nuisance issue, like noisy, unruly neighbors and so on. And I think we hear a lot of the same concerns today, particularly like light and views, noise. Do you feel like you could speak to how the context for how we deal with these nuisance issues today, or how they might present themselves today, is different, so that we might be able to tease out these two separate issues of nuisance and zoning of
Yeah, and I think that actually we were there at the text change committee. I think that, and especially when we were talking to Mordecai, they were, as a partner, they were a great group of people to work with, and we were able to talk about these issues. And they're not right next to NC State. They are next to William Peace, which is growing, but it's relatively small. I don't know how many students at Peace are living in Oakwood and Mordecai, but I also think that the composition of Mordecai is a little different than it is in Cameron Park. The type of person who lives there might be a little different and maybe more accepting of college students, but maybe not. But that, it's a valid concern. I mean, I've been through Cameron Park, and I can see that, like the place where I lived when I was an undergrad, it's owned by basically a slumlord, and they're not taking care of the property. And I would be concerned if, somebody was, potentially going to build another ADU. But that's really not who's building ADUs in other cities. Almost all, I don't have the stat, I've seen it, but almost everybody who builds an ADU is the homeowner who lives on that property. Very infrequently are you going to see somebody build an ADU for additional renters on top of that. Additionally, there's a provision in the code that says that no more than 4 unrelated people can live in a single dwelling in Raleigh. And that was discussed in relation to this, and there's no reason that the code could not be revised to say no more than 4 unrelated individuals can live on a property, or no more than 6 unrelated individuals can live on a property, which would really preclude that situation where there's a house near NC State that's being lived in by 8 college students, and then they build another ADU in the back, and there's another 2, so there's like 10 unrelated people living on a property. The city can address that in its own way. As for like light and sound, again, Mordecai, they pushed back on this. There's a lot of really nice backyards in Mordecai, and they were concerned that it was going to be affected by potentially people living in ADUs, and I respect that. And so we actually revised the regulations to prohibit porches and balconies on facades facing an adjacent property, which is also something that very few, if any, cities do. I've seen a couple other cities do that, but fair enough, that's fine. Totally reasonable thing to expect. Light, the code already has provisions to limit light pollution. The code already has limits to noise pollution, particularly I think in residential neighborhoods. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's the case. So yeah, I mean, again, those are all issues that we'll never actually be able to know for certain are working unless we build them in the first place.
I'm going to try to address maybe what I think you were asking, but if you already have an existing structure on your property in a historic area, do you have to meet the new setbacks to put something in that, or will that be grandfathered in because that property already had that existing structure?
You know, I'm not sure, but I'm going to say in a lot of cities they would grandfather you in. In Raleigh, I'm not sure what they would do, but if you went for a variance and made that case that I've had this garage in my backyard, it's been there longer than I have, it's been there for 75 years, I want a variance to put in a dwelling unit inside it or on top of it. You know, I can't speak for that board, but I would hope that they would approve that.
Hi, thanks for this, giving us this presentation today. So something that kind of came out was this idea of property owners, well, the people who live in the properties they own, not wanting renters in their neighborhoods. I happen to be one of those dirty renters, and
Yeah.
it makes me feel a little hurt when I hear that from my neighbors. Nonetheless, the property I own is owned by someone, and all the other properties are as well. And so I'm curious what mechanisms are in place, or what discussion is being had around this whole ADU thing about enforcement for negligent landlords.
Yeah.
And if that is, I don't know, a more meaningful discussion to be had, or...
No, I mean, that's a valid question. I think that the city's resources, despite Raleigh being very healthy economically, are still strapped. I think that the code enforcement staff should be more than it is. They're struggling to cover the city as it is, especially with how fast it's growing. This is an issue that every city faces. We would have to sort of beef up our inspections process, but there's no easy answer for that. But that goes for a duplex house as much as it does for an accessory dwelling unit or any other residential unit. But it's a really good question that we'll never know. We'll never be able to answer unless we build them.
Well, thanks everybody for coming tonight. Again, if you have any concerns about this, or if you'd like to voice, these things to council, you do have an opportunity to attend the Growth and Natural Resources Committee meeting, which will be this Wednesday at 4 p.m. So feel free to do that, and thank you so much for coming here tonight. I'm sure if you have any additional questions, Charles would be happy to answer those for you as well. So thanks a lot.
Where's it located?
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. It's located in the City Hall. If you know where the council meets, or the meeting council chambers. Yep. So on Hargett Street, 222 Hargett Street. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles.
Thank you.